Good afternoon, and welcome to the first event for the Center for the Study of the Middle East this academic year. I'm Faisal Istarabadi, the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, Sesame we call it. Before we do anything else and before we proceed any further, may I please ask that you turn off your cell phones. Even putting it on vibrate can interfere with the microphones, which I guess should be the first question I ask is, can everybody hear me? I usually don't have trouble making myself heard, but I presume these things are working. Again, welcome to our event. We have, I think, a pretty ambitious and interesting, I hope, set of activities this year. And for anyone who does not receive the Sesame distribution directly, please either see me or Ms. Lisa Hilgeman, the assistant director. If you'd raise your hand, please. I don't know if Ann Kokotis is here somewhere. Ann is right in the back there also with the camera. See, one of the three of us will be delighted to put you on our listserv if you do not already receive our email. We're at war in this country, and it feels less like we are at war, I would argue, much less than it did in 2003, when we were, in some sense, more seriously at war. That is, at least in this case, it's extremely unlikely that, that American troops are going to be in genuine harm's way, although, of course, it's not out of the question because an aerial bombardment does not simply mean pilots at 30 or 40,000 feet or more. The 1,500 or so, or 1,700, whatever the number is now, American troops there do things like spotting and so on for the bombers. And so it's not inconceivable that the United States will take casualties. That, of course, is nothing of the civilian casualties and others that are liable to become casualties in Iraq and Syria, as well as in other places. And I have to say, for a country going to war, I cannot imagine, and this is even having lived through 2003, less of a sense of urgency or of the country being at war. I take it, therefore, and hope that this is a timely panel and one that will discuss at least some of the issues that we face. I'm going to turn the proceedings over now to my distinguished colleague and, if I may say, friend, Professor Dina Speckler, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research interests are in comparative foreign policy and international relations, particularly Russian, Soviet, and American foreign policy and the international relations of the Middle East and Central Asia. Her current research deals with the explanation of major foreign policy change and with competing tendencies in Russian foreign policy. Professor Speckler is an affiliate of the Center for the Study of the Middle East, and I have to say, for any aspiring academic, there is no individual I have met on this campus worthier of the designation of colleague than Dina Speckler. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Faisal, for a very generous introduction. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Ambassador Istarabadi for organizing this panel. I agree that there could not be a more timely, more urgent panel, and one that is more deserving, or a subject that's more deserving of our needs and attention than the U.S. and Iraq, a focus on the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. There is an extraordinary array of expertise to my left here, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce them. They're going to provide, I think, a wonderful diversity of backgrounds and experience, specializations to provide us with insights on this subject. Each panelist is going to aim for 5 minutes of contribution in order to give you plenty of time for contributions or questions of your own. So let me begin in, I guess, alphabetical order. That's the way we're sitting, I believe. Professor Jamshid Choksky is chair of the Department of Central Eurasian Studies, where he's professor of Iranian studies with specialties in Eurasian studies, India studies, and the history of these regions. Professor Choksky is an adjunct in the Department of Religious Studies and is affiliated faculty with Middle East Studies, Islamic Studies, Ancient Studies, and Medieval Studies. He's a member of the National Council on the Humanities, which is a position that requires presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. Ambassador Faisal Istrabadi is the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East and professor of practice of international law and diplomacy here at the Maurer School of Law and the School of Global and International Studies. Ambassador Istrabadi was Iraq's ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the United Nations from 2004 to 2010, and he was the principal drafter of the first post-Saddam constitution, the interim constitution, in the years 2003 to 2004. And he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Professor Leslie Lankowski is a professor of practice in public affairs and philanthropy in SPIA. He was the CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service in Washington, D.C., a position for which he was nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. He's also been assistant and deputy director of the U.S. Information Agency and president of the Hudson Institute in Indianapolis, and is affiliated with the Center for the Study of the Middle East. I'm going to steal one of his lines. He gave me permission to do so. He tells me that he thinks his reason for being here is that a representative of the Bush administration neocons was needed on this panel. There could be other reasons for his inclusion.
I would never confirm that publicly.
I was authorized to reveal this. And next to Professor Lankowski is Professor Kevin Martin, assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. He was also a professor in the Department of History. And his areas of expertise encompass the modern Middle East, the modern Levant, in particular Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and the cultural history of the modern Arab world. And he too is an affiliate of the Center for the Study of the Middle East. And last but most definitely not least is Professor Nazif Shafrani, a professor in the departments of anthropology, Central Eurasian Studies, and Near Eastern languages and cultures. And his research interests encompass the cultural ecology of nomadic pastoralism, state and society, Islamic movements, identity politics, social change and modernization, Muslim family and gender dynamics in Soviet and post-Soviet Central Asia, and broadly speaking, the areas of Afghanistan and Central Asia. He is past chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures and past director of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program. Professor Shafrani is also a Center for the Study of the Middle East affiliate. And having done the introductions, I think very eager to proceed. Are we proceeding in alphabetical order? All right, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, fair enough. So what I'd like to do is just provide a few very broad brushstrokes to get you thinking about the issues at hand and some of the larger ramifications. Just a quick note: when I mention a country or a name, let's say like Saudi Arabia, or I say Emirates, I'm referring to nations and groups rather than individuals, because I know that people are not always responsible for their government's actions. I'd like to talk briefly about three sort of broad categories. One, ISIS's threats outside Syria and Iraq. Second category of reactions, and a third, sort of the broader sources of the problems. In terms of ISIS's threats outside Syria and Iraq, southeastern Turkey is one danger area. Towns like Reyhanli and Haji Pasha have been infiltrated by ISIS, both on the southern border. But even while Turkey faces these threats, Turkey has been equally responsible in fueling ISIS, in being a source for resources flowing to ISIS, personnel flowing to ISIS. Essentially, if you're a Westerner and you want to join ISIS, you now go in through Turkey. And the direct recruitment sites are in Istanbul and Ankara, and the Turkish government has essentially turned a blind eye to this. So, and some of you probably know that whereas US intelligence and US special forces could not rescue 2 reporters, the Turks claimed that they were able to rescue 49 hostages. Internet sources and other sources say that it was actually a deal that was struck. So Turkey is under threat and yet very culpable in all this. Lebanon has borders with both Iraq and Syria, and border towns like Arsal are controlled by ISIS. In the city of Baalbek, there's fighting between ISIS and Lebanese forces and Hezbollah. Keep in mind, Baalbek is just 55 miles by road, not directly, but by road from Beirut and the Mediterranean. Okay. Jordan, again, 2 borders with Syria and Iraq. Some of the border crossings are already held by ISIS. Places that are not directly under attack right now, but are on the radar: southwestern Iran. Okay, so I'm talking about Khuzestan. Sort of, you head southwest of the Zagros Mountains down into the lowlands of what is now sort of the contiguous with Iraq. The population is not Iranian ethnically; it's Arab. It's not Shia; it's Sunni. So that's one place where the Iranians are afraid of penetration. Further, shall we say, sort of further southwards, Kuwait. Again, having a border with Iraq, in danger, yet Kuwait also very culpable in terms of it being a long-standing route for funding of Islamist organizations. Saudi Arabia, border with Iraq, currently trying to build a series of 5 fences stretching 560 miles, and 5 of those to keep the trouble out. Of course, Saudi Arabia, once again, has long been involved as a source of providing this ideology in terms of funding, and the Saudis, of course, are perhaps most to blame for exporting their internal troublemakers, first to Afghanistan, Pakistan, now to places like Iraq and Syria. Okay? And some of you may recall that the fairly recent statement by the former head of MI6, that Prince Bandar, whose foundation was also linked to 9/11, spoke shortly before 9/11 about how the Sunnis were essentially going to wipe out the Shia. And we'll return to that theme here in a moment. There's also the Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar. Qatar has been described as a Club Med for terrorists. Again, these areas have been very fundamental in terms of raising funds for these groups. Perhaps most distant, at least for now and probably always, and essentially most futile for ISIS to make a real strike at is Israel, because they will not be able to penetrate. So that's just to sort of give you a quick sketch of threats. In terms of reactions, the Islamic Republic of Iran has already sent tank brigades to assist Iraqi Kurds. They will almost certainly do so again. If they have to protect central and southern Iraq, they will move in. Iran confirms that they have, as they put it, advisors on the ground. We have advisors there too, so we can decide whether those are troops or, merely people providing guidance. But Iran certainly will not allow the shrines at Najaf and Karbala to be demolished. That just won't happen. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. I think the Saudis and the Emiratis have not quite understood the danger of the game they have been playing for a long time. It's sort of like the inter-services intelligence in Pakistan are playing the game with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and not really recognizing the danger as it keeps coming back home, sort of thinking they can control it, manage it. So those are, I think, two sort of, shall we say, matters again to keep in mind. In terms of sources for the problems, I think there's three basic issues we can hone in. One is social, one is economic, and one is religious. Okay? If you look at places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, I'm always struck at, shall we say, the ultimate, and Faisal, you may disagree with me here, but I say the ultimate sort of lack of a strong sense of nationhood. And the best contrasts in that region there may be with Iran on the one hand and Israel on the other hand. Okay? That things often break down to families, tribes, regional affiliations that tend to be stronger. And I think we saw this in our many years in Iraq and the billions of dollars spent, that ultimately it is very difficult to create senses of national identity if those don't exist, and if people can't find it for themselves. And the other big divide, I would argue, is the Sunni-Shia divide. And let me frame it with two examples. Saddam Hussein in charge of Iraq, the Shia feel that they don't get a shot at the feeding trough. The Shia take over, the Sunnis feel now they don't get the goods. You come to Syria, Alavis, ultimately not Shia, but politically allied with the Shia, not sharing resources with the Sunnis, provokes a rebellion. So what happens? You then have Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, etc., getting involved, supporting those Sunni Islamists in what is both a religious tussle and a political tussle, a tussle between the Saudis and the Iranians, between Sunnis and Shia, this attempt to reduce Shia power, reduce Iranian influence. So we have the Saudis now agreeing as part of this new coalition to train Sunni National Guard brigades, as opposed to Iraqi National Guard brigades. It doesn't really, shall we say, create any kind of new national unity. Think of what happened recently, where the Air Force of the United Arab Emirates flies all the way to Tripoli to fight, to bomb Islamists there, rather than dealing with the problems much closer to home. Okay? So in other words, part of what we are as Americans getting involved in and what we cannot resolve are these sort of larger divides and these issues of what does it take to ultimately feel that one is part of a nation. If one was part of the US military and one doffed one's uniform when enemies were approaching, you would at the very least be court-martialed. If you were a US general who flew out of the base when the base was under attack, you'd be court-martialed. Okay. So I'll just stop at those points, just some things. I hope they're controversial. I want you to start thinking.
Thank you very much.
Well, we're going to have some controversy.
If you can build Iraq back together, good for you.
But on the other hand, let me begin at least notionally with what I intended to say and not be moved away from what I intended to say. How did we get here? And I'm going to focus principally on an Iraqi perspective, although not exclusively. Well, I think the way that we got here, viewed from the perspective of Iraq, is that for too long, US policy in Iraq, aided and abetted to a very large degree by the new political class in Iraq, in fact, without whom the project would not have come to the quote-unquote fruition, if that's the word that it has, has been to reduce Iraq exactly to its constituents. Now, the processes of division in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, are processes I was an eyewitness to during the drafting of the interim constitution, a shared vision, a shared national Iraqi vision dissolved palpably. You could feel it happening. And it started with, at least in 2003, with the manner in which the American occupation envisaged Iraq. I don't have time in 10 minutes or 10 days to go through a play-by-play of how the next 10 years played out. But by 2014, there was ample evidence. In fact, in 2012, there was ample evidence, and I say 2012 because I said at a Middle East Institute event in Washington, D.C. with Jeffrey Feltman on my panel, at the time the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, now an Assistant Secretary General at the UN, that we were headed in this direction, that we were headed in a direction where the Sunnis would be in open rebellion and where the United States would have a choice to make about returning with military force. And I also said, by the way, that Turkey could easily accommodate Kurdish independence if that were to happen, in order to create a buffer state between an increasingly rising Iranian Tehran-Baghdad axis. Well, fundamentally what you had by June of 2014 was a population, a Sunni population, Iraq's second largest ethno-confessional group, that had reason to believe that it was disenfranchised. And it embraced or went into alliances of convenience with a heinous group, which I will call ISIL, or although it's also called ISIS in English, Daesh. Now the French are calling it the Arabic Daesh, which is the Arabic equivalent of ISIL. But the French Foreign Ministry now calls it Daesh. Laurent Fabius calls it the Daesh cutthroats. Not an inappropriate name. And really, for the first time in our history, as others have pointed out, you know, there's one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. And I mean the word church in both its senses, both in the sense of a church as a community of believers, but also in the sense of a building. Happens to be in Iraq, in Mosul. And for the first time in 2,000 years, Mass is not being said in Mosul. There has been a near genocide or an attempted genocide of Iraq's Yazidi population, and I could go on. Yes, the Iraqi army collapsed on June the 9th, or June the 10th rather, 2014. And I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that if American senior officers abandoned their posts, the American army would collapse. When men see their senior and I see somebody wearing a uniform there, when senior and junior officers flee their posts, it's hard for the men to stand there and fight. They need to see their officers in charge. And the problem here came down to Nur al-Maliki, the then Prime Minister of Iraq, whom American officials have said over the past 4 years has been coup-proofing the army, which is to say he has removed professional soldiers, professional senior officers, and replaced them with cronies. He has under-equipped the regular army and under-trained them. And senior former American generals responsible for training the Iraqi army have said that if the American army stopped training, in 3 years it would collapse too. That training is not something you do once and you're finished with. So these are some of the reasons that we are where we are. I do disagree very much that there is no sense of Iraqi national identity, but I'm not going to address that. I hope the point of this is to engage in a conversation, and I hope that there'll be time in the question and answer period. Where are we now? Well, I advocated for, and I supported the American administration's position that it would not engage ISIL, at least let's say in Arab Iraq, until and unless two conditions were met. The first was that there was a new inclusive government that at least attempted to, I won't say undo the sectarian dispensation that we have unfortunately engendered in Iraq, but at least to attempt to dial it down and to cool the passions. And that included a new prime minister, that the Prime Minister Maliki should not have a third term. The second, that that government be committed to national healing. We at least appear to have accomplished both those goals, hence the President's speech to the nation outlining what he had promised to be a sustained and substantial effort to defeat ISIL in Iraq. We'll see what he has to say about Syria. That part of it appears to me to be extremely shaky. I have more to say about the Iraqi government, but perhaps again in the question and answer period we will have a chance for that. Let me say this about Syria, and I know that my colleague, Professor Martin, is far more expert about Syria than I am, but it would seem to me that we are in a position where we are in an alliance with the Syrian government's enemies against ISIL, but also indirectly in an alliance with the government of Syria against its enemies, at least insofar as, I take it that if we degrade ISIL, one of the beneficiaries is the government of Bashar al-Assad, which has committed numerically far greater atrocities than ISIL has to date. Not to say ISIL isn't prepared to improve on its statistics, but it hasn't actually, it hasn't killed 200,000 people yet. The problems are profound, and I think that where Professor Choksi started us with a kind of as it were, a whirlwind tour, was an excellent place to start. The King of Jordan was interviewed yesterday on 60 Minutes, and he said that 20% of the Jordanian population today are Syrian refugees. Now that's the same as 60 million refugees in the United States. And today, if you look at Al Arabiya English, you will see pictures of the Turkish government using water cannon to repel Kurdish refugees from Syria, saying it's overflowing, having accepted 100,000 refugees. I think the situation in the Middle East is extremely volatile for all countries, Israel included. Not that I expect ISIS to occupy Israel, but it doesn't need to. It can make trouble in other ways, ask Hamas. For Iraq, the question remains whether we have a viable state. But if Iraq falls, if Syria falls, other states are at risk, and no state, in my judgment, is safe. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here this afternoon, even though this is not my principal area of expertise, though I am very interested in groups like ISIS or ISIL as expressions of a particular type of
I meant to do that and forgot.
Oops, that's okay. Expressions of a particular type of civil society or uncivil society, as the case may be. But let me just say a few words in this introductory period on policy issues. For only the second time in its 70-year history, a sitting president of the United States will chair a meeting of the United Nations Security Council this week, Wednesday, I believe, when President Obama chairs the council meeting to discuss a proposed resolution about travel and other aspects of international terrorism. The first president to do this, by the way, was Barack Obama in 2009, when the resolution on the table had to do with issues of nuclear proliferation, particularly related to Iran. I think the president's willingness, desire, I assume, to chair this meeting symbolizes the significance of the issue of what to do about ISIS to the administration. And it is significant politically, of course, and by taking this extraordinary step, the President is adding to his efforts to convey to the American public a sense of urgency. And of course, it's also an important issue of national security that's being addressed. The concern and the focus of the resolution is the prospect that ISIS and other groups will be exporting violence to their neighbors and to other countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States. I think, although I'd be interested in discussion of this, that the notion that ISIS is a serious threat as a conventional military force is not one that is widely accepted. Despite the successes it had in Iraq, to some degree Syria, it's also had reverses, and those reverses have occurred fairly quickly and with a fairly modest military effort. So I don't think that the major concern is a conventional military one. Rather, of course, the major concern is the unconventional one, that acts of terror triggered by ISIS or its allies will occur outside of its immediate geographic region. And so the purpose of the United Nations resolution is really less about, to use President Obama's words, degrading and destroying, and much more about containing and intercepting. But the question, especially with the historical analogy of the resolution on nuclear proliferation in mind, what must be asked is, will this resolution be more successful than that earlier one? The challenges are actually much more difficult in this case. First of all, the principal objects of the resolution, terrorists, have no fixed form or place. They are, in the currently fashionable jargon, non-state actors. They also have demonstrated considerable skill at communications and limited dependence on the kinds of financial support that can be with difficulty but cut off, but nonetheless we know how to do this. Secondly, the object of this resolution has the capacity to change and grow, to mutate, you might say. ISIS is one of several groups now working more or less the same territory, and their actions do not appear to be very coordinated. And then we ought not to forget about Al-Qaeda itself, which in various ways has indicated it would like to be center stage again. Or to put the matter differently, the problem with the Obama administration strategy and others is that the international community is far better at directing its efforts to deal with other states, but organizations like ISIS thrive in places which lack states, which lack governments, and so they are a much bigger problem, much more difficult problem to address. So what to do? Let me throw out three provocative ideas in conclusion. One is that widely discredited idea of state building needs to be considered again and implemented again. It's a hard, if and sometimes seemingly impossible task. It involves casualties not only of the United States, but especially in other nations, civilian casualties. It may involve an unpleasant choice of allies, some of whom may, through the back door, actually be encouraging the spread of terrorism. But nonetheless, one would like to think, and judging from the comments of Secretary Panetta over the weekend, perhaps one is entitled to think that the current administration is realizing that it perhaps turned away from state building too hastily. Whether or not, however, the American public has accepted that is a very different question, and one that will inevitably affect the actions of the administration. Secondly, we need to put pressure on states that provide support to terrorist groups. The most obvious, of course, would be Iran, and it has been interesting to hear the debate over whether or not Iran should be part of a coalition to deal with ISIS. This is an unusual debate, to put it mildly, and also pressure has to be brought not only to some of the funders of ISIS, some of whom Ambassador Istrabadi just mentioned, but also the president of Syria itself, Mr. Assad. It is certainly correct that we are being seen as somehow allied with Assad, but that is not inevitable if we simultaneously put pressure on him and his regime. Finally, the last question, probably the most provocative of all. We need really to think carefully, and we certainly have more experts on this here than I am, about the question of whether or not there is something that is giving rise to extremist movements of the most violent sort among young Muslims. The last time I had the privilege to participate in a gathering of this center, our topic was Arab Spring. We have now witnessed the replacement on YouTube and indeed in the mind of the world of the image of young Arabs being optimistic promoters of democracy with a far different and less attractive image, that of a YouTube executioner. Why has this occurred? What can be done about it?
I'll confine my comments to ISIL in Syria, and more specifically, how it is perceived, the threat, again, and the long-term consequences of its presence are perceived, and briefly present an argument that we are missing the critical point for Syria, for its history, and for its future, and then try to place this conflict, this current conflict, in the context of Syrian domestic politics and its history since independence at the end of the Second World War. But I have to start by saying that events are moving so fast in Syria that I don't feel like I can present any sort of analysis that will stand in 2, 3, 5 days. As Professor Istrabadi mentioned, there have been developments on the Turkish border in the last 2 days, in which we are told more than 130,000 Syrians, primarily Kurds, crossed the Turkish border in the last 7 to 10 days, and that's in addition to the previous approximately 100,000 Syrian refugees who are being housed in Turkey. And this, of course, raises all sorts of issues for national security from the Turkish perspective in the terms of of Kurdish trans-border, cross-border Kurdish alliances and so on. But in the Syrian case, I think within Syria, it highlights the real issue, which is, in essence, the ethnic cleansing of central Syria and of the Euphrates Valley in particular. We have seen, as again was referenced earlier, the siege on Mount Sinjar against the Yazidi population in Iraq, which is just across the border from Syria on the east bank of the Euphrates. And you see similar operations taking place inside Syria. We don't have reliable statistics, but all of the indications are that, again, in an area of Syria that has been historically diverse in terms of sect and ethnicity, we are now seeing virtually all of the Christian population, virtually all of the Yazidi population, and virtually all, specifically, of the Armenian Christian population being cleansed from this area. The city of Deir ez-Zor, one of the largest cities in Syria, which is on the Euphrates, is under siege. And this is doubly tragic when one compares that situation to the situation in Aleppo. We are told that ISIL has now displaced most of the rebels around Aleppo and is surrounding, its forces surround 2/3 of the city. Both of these cities were, ironically and tragically, were the endpoints for the Armenian genocide during the First World War. When Armenians were force-marched into Syria, this is where most of them either died or stopped, in these two places. And the path that ISIL is cleansing follows that path of march. So 100 years ago, we have one enormous manifestation of ethnic cleansing, and now this is being repeated in the other direction, from Syria into Turkey. And I would argue that this raises all sorts of questions about the cycle of history in the region. If you recall, all of the states that we've been talking about were created by external forces at the end of the First World War, just 2 years shy of 100 years ago. And if you look at the capital of the ISIL state in Syria, its provincial capital, where this, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, the leader of the Syrian branch of ISIL, has supposedly set up his capital. This is Raqqa, which is in an agricultural area in northeast Syria, north to northeast Syria, which, again, one of the most diverse places in Syria. If you look at the areas, look at a map of the areas that ISIL has not penetrated, largely speaking, it is the ones that are ethnically homogeneous, or in terms of sectarian identity homogeneous. They have made no inroads in the Alawi mountain on the Mediterranean coast. They've made no inroads in the Jabal Druze on the Jordanian border, where most of the Druze population is concentrated. They've made very little headway in the extreme northeast, which is almost exclusively Kurdish in population. So I would say that is ISIL, in my opinion, is not a viable state. I don't think that the threat is constituted in, there's little or no chance that these people could create a sustainable polity inside Syria, but before they are destroyed or dispersed, they can transform the demography of Syria, and irreversibly so. And I believe that that is what the untold story that is occurring now. And as many of my colleagues have noted, there's one theme in this story is the interference of outside forces. And this is a leitmotif in Syrian historiography. You're seeing a repeat of, in many ways, of the struggle for control of Syria and its foreign policy alignment. Whose ally will it be? Whereas in the past, the issue was, would it be allied with a British Iraq, British-friendly Iraq, or would it be allied with a pan-Arabist Egypt? Saudi Arabia has always played a role in this, this manipulation of Syria's internal domestic politics. It continues to do so to this day, as do all of Syria's neighbors, actually. And this is a these neighbors have always, and their international sponsors, their superpower sponsors, have always interfered in Syria's domestic politics, always manipulating and exacerbating these problems. This is just the most extreme example to date. And finally, I would say a theme of Syrian history that seems to be playing out again is that most people, Syrians have not had, with one exception, one very brief period, they have not had a democratic option in terms of choosing their governments. Their governments have been imposed by others. And in almost every case, what seems to be the worst possible regime is replaced by something even worse. And that has been a pattern since the Second World War, and I fear that, at least temporarily, that may be a pattern we're seeing again. I have a few more comments that I'd be happy to share during the general discussion about the way in which ISIL is seen by Syrians in exile, or what indications we have of Syrians who were still present in Syria. Given what I've just said about Syria's history, there's a tendency to go for the conspiracy theory among Syrians in general. And that is understandable, I think, and there's a whole list of these, a menu of such conspiracy theories to explain ISIL's success, but I'll leave that for later. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to focus on the part of the title for this forum that has not been addressed yet, and that is U.S. back again. It's not again, but several agains. And what I would like to, I think, address, and my colleagues have already hinted in, is the approach, United States approach to these crises that pop up one after another, and in fact have been since World War I and World War II and earlier on, if you like, with the creation of modern nation states. And that is, the approach has been management of crisis, not solving any of the crisis. We are concerned with episodic development of episodic crises and go out there and get it somehow resolved, and then congratulate ourselves that we have just done that. But never seriously focused in addressing the core causes of why these crises are continuing. And we have a genealogy of these that you can go, just start with a PLO becoming Hamas, and then Ayatollahs in Iran, and then Taliban in Afghanistan, becoming Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda turning into Zarqawi Al-Qaeda, and then now ISIL. Can we ask about what these are all about? And the answer is, generally that are offered to us is, these are extremist Islamic fundamentalists, this or that. I'm sorry, it is politics of rage. It is politics of rage. It has to do with, fundamentally with politics and political issues in the area. And religion and other things become drawn in to justify. And when did anybody seriously address the root political causes of what my colleagues have described so far? Why Shia Sunni? Dispute at all. These folks had lived for centuries with one another and managed to cope with one another, their difficulties, and resolve them in their own way, and maybe even solve them until, again, what my colleague says, the outsiders coming in, and that is the creation of modern nation-state borders, which were really the foundation of it all, with the creation of modern nation-states and dividing and gerrymandering borders in a manner which was to produce crisis after crisis after crisis. And whether it was Western colonial powers or Soviet colonial powers, the Tsarist colonial powers, they did exactly the same thing. And that creation of a condition that produces politics of rage necessitates inviting your big brothers, the old colonial big brothers, to come and help solve it. They don't solve it, they're not interested in solving it, because if it were solved, there will be nothing for them to do. And it goes back, I think in the case of the United States, we are not really considering our own part in the creation of this crisis around the world, and especially in the Middle East. As Graham Fuller called it, America takes the sort of immaculate conception of crisis approach, that US has nothing to do with it. They only go there to solve it. Not solve it, resolve it. It's not immaculate conception at all. That there are external forces that produces these particular crises, and then they go and manage it. And it goes back again to a wonderful concept that we have all heard from President Eisenhower in his farewell speech of 1961, military-industrial complex. That necessitates these crises to be there. If they were not there, they would be created. And in fact, they have been created, and the reason for continuation of them is that there is no interest in solving them. Only interest in resolving them, and continually doing so. So until there is, in fact, interest on the part of the citizens of this great country to demand that their own government not just deceive them, not play duplicitous policies elsewhere, that we know some of the people with whom we're fighting, we are actually funding. Your taxpayer, my taxpayer, everybody else's taxpayer in this room is in fact funding and has been funding the enemies, the people that we refer to as our enemies of the United States, and go out there and fight them. There is a wonderful book, for those of you who haven't seen, on Afghanistan. A local journalist, Doug Wissing, has written, it's called Funding the Enemy. A book of only 200 and something pages of text and almost 200 pages of documentation of how your money, my taxpayer money, has been spent to fund the Taliban in the last 13 years. And ISIL and the like are also being funded. What weapon are they using to fight the United States or Iraq or anyone else? It's the United States of America's weapons. Everything they ride, everything they shoot from is made in America. And we need to ask ourselves that if the Iraqi problem could not have been solved, we only resolved by removing Saddam, but not solving the fundamental problem that Iraqi people faced with Saddam, before Saddam, and that it has been continuing and in fact festering further. We could have done the same thing in Afghanistan. What happened yesterday in Afghanistan is a new phase, a new crisis, not a resolution of any sort. A resolution may be temporary, but not solution at all. Couldn't we have, in fact, created a government that would have worked in the last 13, 14 years in Afghanistan with $1 trillion spent on war and over $100 billion spent on so-called reconstruction? These are, I think, the fundamental questions that we have to label these basically politics of rage that has been in the Middle East for the last 6, 7, 8 decades. And blaming it on religion has got us further away from solving the problem or addressing the issue. So until, as we go back to that formula of the Iranian version, 2 + 2 is not 5. Anybody who insists on 2 + 2 is 5 is murdering the truth. And I think we have been in the business of murdering the truth about what is going on and why are we going again and again and again in this part of the world. And unless we face that fact of these issues have to do with politics, and unless we address the political roots of these crises, there will be no solution at all, and it will continue and will be there again and again, and these names will change and transform to something new, but we will be there. And the question is, do we really want to continue to be there? Eisenhower thought if we hadn't looked into the problem of military-industrial complex, that we will have to continue this. So is it time for us as a nation to ask ourselves, to essentially listen once again to what President Eisenhower in 1961 warned this country? And if we don't, then we shouldn't really talk about again at all. It's just, it's a wish. It's a recipe for continuation of politics of rage in that part of the world, and people will only become even more enraged rather than less until the root causes of the problem are addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have the... I have the sense that the panel members could easily take the rest of our time to debate one another, but I won't let that happen, at least not until you've had your chance to ask questions. I'm going to take the liberty of repeating the questions that are asked so that they can be recorded as part of the recording of the session. So are there any questions from the audience? Yes. So a reference was made to a document called the Clean Break document prepared by Richard Pearl for Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel in 1996, which then became the basis of the Project for a New American Century that envisioned widespread reshaping of the Middle East for the benefit of the U.S. and Israel, especially involving increasing sectarian conflict. And with a reference to that document, the questions are, I guess, twofold. What is the relationship between the conflict between the U.S. and Iran and the conflict with ISIL? And in particular, why are we excluding Iran from any effort to deal with ISIL? What is the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and how is that, or is that, enhancing the difficulty of arriving at a solution with regard to ISIL? And then what are the unintended consequences of U.S. involvement in the Middle East or in this conflict, particularly with regard to perceptions of the U.S. in the Middle East? And with that, I'll turn that over. Les.
We have 4 microphones. I don't know how we ended up passing them back and forth.
Okay,
Here we are.
Here we are. Okay, well, I know Richard Pearl, and he's a man of many accomplishments, including being a very good cook. But I don't think...
Cooked up a mess in Iraq. Cooked up a mess in Iraq.
Cooked up a mess in Iraq, but I don't think he could fairly be blamed for sectarian conflict in the Middle East, which we heard earlier has a very lengthy history. But let me, and as for the other one of the other factual assertions, at least it's been reported that the exclusion of Iran from the talks in Paris was at the instigation of the Saudi government, not the United States government. I have no doubt at all the United States government may have been supportive of that, and I have no reason to know one way or another whether the reporting is correct. But also, I think one thing that has come out clearly in this panel is the complexity of these relationships in the region that don't lend themselves to very simple theories. But let me address your central point, which is the unintended consequence of U.S. action. And I think it's worth reminding everybody that the current occupant of the White House came into office with the intention of creating a very different kind of policy than not only his immediate predecessor, but also previous administration. By the way, I'm always love this newfound respect for Dwight Eisenhower, who, lest we forget, landed paratroopers in Lebanon in the 1950s as well. There's been a long history here. We have seen, one could argue, we are seeing an unintended consequence of the current administration's policy right now, that by reversing course, reducing the role of the United States in the region, perhaps it is the United States indeed that has helped bring on the kind of cataclysm that we're looking at right now.
When we get to this issue of blame game in terms of the West's involvement, yes, certainly we can say, a lot of these, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, yes, these are all creations of a particular period of Western meddling in the region. Okay. And then we could argue, well, maybe the maps are being redrawn now, violently. But we still have to ask ourselves, then, do we say, okay, we meddled, so now things are sort of reshaping? But then we like to also come back and sort of blame ourselves for that reshaping as well, which doesn't seem to sort of loop back around, okay? And then we say, well, maybe we shouldn't be there, but then if we weren't there, what happens to all this humanitarian crisis we were talking about? Right? Do we just walk away from it all and just, say, okay, yes, we meddled, we shouldn't have done that, we'll stay out of it completely. Just don't come bother us. You come bother us, we'll kill you. If not, we'll stay out of it, kill yourselves. Is that humane? Is that an appropriate response? So, let me just bring that up as well. Now, you also asked about Iran's exclusion or involvement. Yes, I too have heard that it was at the Saudi instigations that Iran was excluded, which goes back to the Saudi-Iranian tension, which I will submit also does go back not just to politics, but also to a religious divide. Now, should Iran be excluded? Is Iran actually being excluded? I would suggest that, in fact, there's a tacit working relationship. There's always been one. To different degrees. The problem with the United States is often we cannot compartmentalize our issues. The Iranians, on the other hand, have not made it easy for us to include them. We have the Supreme Leader and others claiming that ISIS begins in the White House. So it's difficult to sort of include people who are also at the same time sort of making sure to push us away. Yet, we do know in northern Iraq that the United States was present recently, Iran was present, and they seem to cooperate towards a common goal. And I would suggest that we're more likely to see that kind of cooperation continuing.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take some other question from the audience. Yes, sir. Thank you. So the question was, doesn't outside involvement in the Middle East go back far longer than simply Western involvement in the last 100 years? And are there significant differences between the previous meddling by outside powers and the role of Western powers?
Do you want to take this?
Go ahead. Since it's Levant, it's yours.
I mean, what can we do better? Can we meddle better? Is that the? I'm not being facetious. I mean, is that the question? I would say we are accomplished meddlers, but we rarely seem to get the outcome that we're seeking.
If we're seeking.
If we're seeking a particular outcome. No, I don't. I'm not. My purpose is not to compare and contrast and evaluate various forms or modes of meddling. I was just saying that this is, in the Syrian case, since it became a mandate territory of France, that domestic conflict was always overlain with regional and global conflict, and that outside forces always perpetuated, enabled, exacerbated that conflict, and that this is just a continuation of that process. And frankly, I think the meddlers who had the most effect were the regional ones, Syria's neighbors, if that answers your question.
Thank you. In the back there. The question, as I understood it, is that ISIS has been compared to a Protestant version of Islam. And if ISIS were more authentic, then would that have an implication for the politics of rage? Is that the?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Well, politics of rage generally does not rely on any particular ideology. I mean, ideologies are justifications for the kinds of political rights that people think they have been denied. The emergence of ISIL, and I think Ambassador Strabadi suggested, had to do with the way the political dynamics in Baghdad shaped up under the US aegis, I suppose, after the overthrow of Saddam, that the Sunnis repeatedly got the shorter end of the stick. And the government in Iraq essentially did everything to disenfranchise them, weaken them, kill them, eliminate them, and so forth. And this is the sort of recipe for politics of rage anywhere. And the ideology that they're pursuing, obviously, again, we don't know who is this particular guy that is calling himself al-Baghdadi. His identity is in doubt as to who he is working for. Obviously, the kinds of deeds they are participating or engaging in cannot be condoned by the religion that they supposedly are adhering. There is no way. The sensational sort of killing of innocent people in front of cameras and throwing them out there is, again, an act of rage. It's not an act of faith. And if they were, again, this abuse of religion is not just unique to them. The Saudi monarchy does the same thing. The Egyptian General Sisi does the same thing. And Assad does the same thing. So Islam is basically a tool in the hands of whoever has power to hold on to, or others who want to dislodge that power from whoever has it for themselves. I think focusing on religion is really detracting us from addressing the problems squarely. In America's choice is not being there or not being there. It's not just either we should be there or we should get the hell out. I don't think that's the way things are. If your superpower, as this country is, then you have responsibilities. If you go and break things, you should own them. It has been said repeatedly. That's what happened in Iraq, at least. America went there, broke it up, and now, we have responsibilities. We have options. The option, I think what I suggested was, are we sincerely, as a nation, interested in solving those problems that produces these crises and politics of rage? If so, then we can do things differently than the way we have done it.
I don't necessarily disagree with what Professor Shahrani said, but I would like to flip it and say I'm an Iraqi. I'm also an American citizen, but I'm also an Iraqi. And I'm an Arab, and I'm a Middle Easterner. And I guess I would say, for us, where is the counter argument that Professor Shahrani is making for us? Where have we owned up to the responsibility of the acts that are being committed in our name or in the name of our religion? Hisham Milham has just written an article to this effect, a Lebanese journalist, You can agree or disagree with it. I think it's on Politico or Huffington Post, one or the other. You can agree or disagree with it. But at least he's attempting to have a conversation, to start a discussion that Professor Shahrani is trying to start from the American side that I do not see occurring on the other side. Not publicly, at least. The thing that's frightening about some of this, when we say Qatar is supporting this, we don't necessarily mean the government of Qatar, although it may be parts of the government of Qatar. But in any event, it is people in the elites, people who are extremely wealthy by any standard. That is to say, these are people who are deeply invested, no pun intended, in the world economic system, who nevertheless donate and raise funds for these kinds of groups. Now, this is a problem we need to address. Yes, and let me say this, so you don't think I'm just looking at it from one perspective. I was ambassador at the United Nations actively for 3 years, and it was anathema to the Bush administration to bring up the issue of root causes of terrorism. They hate us because we're free, as if, Al-Qaeda can't get to sleep at night because we have a Fourth Amendment right to be free from search and seizure. I mean, it's just absurd. And the lack of introspection is actually insulting to anyone with a brain. That is a fundamental problem. But I have to say, on the other side, when I'm dealing with deeply entrenched elites supporting these heinous acts, and you talk about authenticity, if Islam sanctioned the genocide of the Yazidis 1,400 years after the Islamic conquest of Iraq, there would be no Yazidi for you to have heard of. There would not be a Christian for you to have heard of by now if Islam sanctioned what is being done to Iraq's Christian and Yazidi and the Shabaks and so on. So I think we have to have balance. I think that we need more introspection all the way around. And I think no one is advocating, and I want to emphasize, no one is advocating a withdrawal of the United States. Mm-hmm. Because if the United States withdraws, there will be a vacuum. We know that nature abhors a vacuum. When the British withdrew, at least there was the answer of who takes its place was the United States, which was, by the way, Richard Haas's PhD dissertation, I think. But if the United States withdraws, what takes its place or who takes its place is something that ought to keep us all up at night. The question isn't whether the U.S. is there. The question is what's it doing there.
Thank you. All right. Over here. Yes. How has the recent flight of Kurds into Turkey going to affect the probability of a Kurdish state in the area?
In my view, this is one of the reasons the Turks may be blocking the entrance of Kurds into Turkey. Turkey has proportionately far more Kurds, I think, well, numerically more, I don't know about proportion, numerically more, but then, of course, Turkey has a much larger population than Iraq.
Both, it's true, both.
Both are true? Thank you. So both numerically and proportionately more. And I think that could well be one of the reasons and what you've had since June of 2014, as far as Iraq's Kurdish leadership is concerned, is something new, and that is a cooperation across the internationally recognized boundaries that you haven't had over the last 10 years of Kurdish forces, and that must be focusing everyone's minds as well.
Yes.
Yeah, let me just just follow up right on that. What Faisal was saying is completely correct, that if you look at it from the Iranian perspective, the Islamic Republic will not permit the Iranian Kurds to become independent or to join Pan-Kurdistan. So you may very well end up, one of the consequences of all what's happening may be that you'll end up finding that even as Turkey and Iran clash over places like Iraq and Syria, that they'll also eventually find common cause in cooperating against the Kurds.
Yes, over here. Even if we succeed in apprehending the leadership of ISIL, how will that affect the ability of the role of these organizations and the spread of their ideas? Okay, thank you.
Okay. The American policy in the area has not been only to manage the crisis episodically, but it has also been person-centered. That it supports particular royal families, it supports particular people that is our devils, who work in these countries, essentially, at least the way it is perceived by their locals as well, that they're working for America and Americans. And in other words, one critical thing that is absent in the area is promotion of a set of democratic values, democratic institutions, and democratic processes. That our efforts has not been towards promotion of those kinds of things, but rather finding our person, our man, and then trying to put them in place and hoping that it'll get things done. It hasn't happened, and it won't happen. And as long as we promote these regimes and the kinds of individuals and person-centered sort of politics that is pervasive in the area, I think that we cannot hope for any positive change. In what Ambassador Faisal Sarabadi was mentioning earlier on about being introspective, that is, who in this part of the world should be doing that introspection. This is a region with a religion that has no church, no central authority whatsoever. It's not like Catholicism. And orthodoxy in this part of the world, in the name of Islam, has always been defined by those who run the state, not by scholars, not by ulama. As a result, you don't have one orthodoxy, you have multiple orthodoxies. Iran has its own, Saudis, Egyptians, everybody has that. Okay? So as long as again, the problem comes back to the core political institutions that rule these countries. And unless and until the choice of political institutions in these regions are changed, transformed, that relies on a core principle, set of values, set of institutions, and so forth, away from individuals. This is what America is all about. It's not about individuals. It's about a set of core values and core institutions and processes where George Bush could come in, could not do too much damage. Okay? So this is what Middle East is lacking. This is what Muslim countries are lacking. And the reason why they're lacking is not because there is no introspection, no wish, no will on the part of people to do this, but because they are governed with the help of the post-colonial powers in a manner which makes it impossible for these transformative changes to take place.
Thank you.
So introspection is not there, it's not going to happen.
You know, let's keep in mind that in the current events that more Muslims have killed other Muslims than anyone else.
Of course. Okay?
And as Nazif was talking there, Faisal leaned across and told me that, you know, that we should make a point of pointing out that, that the majority of Muslims in the region reject what's going on. But I think when we put together what Nazif was saying, Faisal was saying, what we have discussed here on the panel, this issue of, you know, responsibility lying on, shall we say, both sides, if you wish to, that that how does one prevent, you know, this? It's sort of like, you know, the Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda then becoming a worse form, then, you know, this sort of getting worse and worse, every incarnation, if you wish to, getting worse than the one before it. And there does come a point where that majority of Muslims are going to have to stand up against the killers in their midst. In other words, ultimately, you know, US troops and going there, it's a temporary solution. The majority of the population has to get up and at a certain point say, no more. We're not tolerating a small group, you know, running around saying all Shia need to be killed, or small group of Shia saying all Sunnis need to be killed, or that we kill the Yazidis. No, that there's common good, a common understanding of religion, and a certain degree of tolerance of differences. And that's ultimately not something that outsiders can do.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. What kind of political solution is possible in Syria at some point in time, perhaps when ISIL will no longer exist?
In short, I don't know, and anyone who tells you they do is lying to you, and probably to themselves as well. But I would suggest that if a solution, if ISIL can be destroyed or displaced and some sort of political settlement is put forth in Syria, it will involve Bashar al-Assad. He's not going anywhere.
May I take exception to this a little bit? I think there is a way out. We know that in multi-ethnic societies, in societies with diverse cultural, linguistic, sectarian communities, there is a way out. And the way out is adopting the principle of community self-governance, local self-governance. And one important thing about the Middle East would be denationalization of religion. One of the tragedies of Middle Eastern history in postmodern nation-state era has been bringing religion and nationalizing it through constitutions, with a few exceptions that left it out, Turkey, for example. But the rest of them, in some form or fashion, have nationalized Islam. Nationalization of Islam is nationalization of small local problems into major national ones. It needs to be dealt with, in that if principle of community self-governance is applied, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, that small communities, linguistic communities, religious, sectarian communities and so forth will be given autonomy, self-governance at a local level, that they will be perfectly in fine shape as long as there is also a national law that is rule of law, not ruler's law. In the Middle East, we only have ruler's law, never rule of law. Whoever rules basically dictates everything. And that's what the issue is, that there is a way out. It's not, this country is the most diverse. What is the secret of America? Managing diversity, allowing community self-governance, institutional self-governance. It's not true in any of the other Middle Eastern countries, Islamic countries in particular. And those of us who work in the Ostrom workshop know that there are solutions, and the solutions have to come from the bottom up. And nobody is allowing that to happen in the Middle East, in the Muslim countries. And as long as that doesn't happen, there is no hope.
Okay. Yes, sir. So the question was, given that ISIL appears to be doing a good deal of its own state building, who is going to be able to destroy that, and what will be the consequences of destroying that?
Well, I'm by no means privy to any information that others here aren't privy to, but it seems to me that the issue is not what can be done, but whether there's a will to do it. There's no evidence, and again, just from casual observation, that the state building efforts are more than very superficial, that they can't be reversed. As I said in my remarks, the actual battlefield performance was not particularly exceptional. I mean, remember the Peshmerga weaponry until the very end was quite out of date. So I don't think that is going to be the issue. The question is going to be the will. And while just to comment briefly on what's gone before, I do want to remind everyone, again, from somebody who's been in Washington and takes a Washington-centric perception of all this, we've just had a 5-year reversal of policy. It's important to keep in mind that the first major foreign policy address President Obama gave was in Cairo. And while it was a complex address, I don't think it is unfair to characterize it as offering an invitation to the various groups within the Middle East to have exactly the kinds of conversations several people have referred to. We all have our own contacts in the Middle East. Mine are relatively few compared to my colleagues, but certainly there is a profound sense of disappointment with how little follow-through there was, whether from the United States or from within the region, to that speech, although we did have the notable outpouring of Arab Spring, which, again, with some partial exceptions, such as Tunisia, has proved to be disappointing. So the question remains not whether we should see these conversations or indeed fundamental efforts at government restructuring, but why has it been so hard to have them come from within? Is it simply a matter of outside forces, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank the audience for their questions and thank the panelists for the insight that they've offered us on this situation.
Nice to meet you. And nice to see you again. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much.